The year is 2001. It is a clear Tuesday morning in September. The fall weather has yet to kick in. Fashion Week had just begun in New York. Then President George W. Bush went for a morning jog in Florida. Iraq shot down a Predator drone. Millions of Americans from coast to coast were just settling in for the morning, prepared for another day of life. It wasn't until 8:46 a.m., when Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City, that people realized that day would be anything but normal.
Take two and 2, 1. This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way!
There has just been a huge explosion. We can see a billowing smoke rising. And I'll tell you that I can't see that second tower, but there was a cascade of sparks and fire, and I cannot see behind that smoke, obviously, as you can either. What is behind it, which I cannot tell you.
Mychal Fallon Judge, birth name Robert Emmett Judge, was born on May 11, 1933, in Brooklyn, New York City, near the start of the Great Depression. He had a twin sister, and his parents were immigrants from Ireland. Unfortunately, his father died of mastoiditis when Judge was only 6 years old. Shortly after his father died, Judge would visit St. Francis of Assisi Church, which inspired him to become a friar. After years of going to religious school, Robert wound up changing his legal name to a saint name, Fallon Mychal, but dropped the Fallon and changed Mychal to be unique. After attending a seminary in Washington, D.C., Mychal Judge was ordinated as a priest in 1986. He was assigned to the St. Francis of Assisi Church, the very same church as mentioned before. In 1992, Judge was appointed as chaplain of the New York City Fire Department, where he often worked 16-hour days. Judge was well known in the city for ministering to the outcasts of society, such as the homeless, people with AIDS, the hungry, recovering alcoholics, the sick, injured and grieving, immigrants, and people in the LGBT community. One of the more touching stories of Judge's life is when a man dying of AIDS asked him, "Do you think God hates me?" In response, Judge picked up the man, kissed him, and silently rocked him in his arms. Even up until his death, Judge would march in pride parades and attend other LGBT events. On September 11, 2001, upon learning that the World Trade Center had been hit, Judge rushed to the site. Then Mayor Rudolph Giuliani asked Judge to pray for the city and its victims. Mychal prayed over the bodies lying in the street, then attended the lobby of the North Tower, where he continued to offer aid and prayers for the rescuers, the injured, and the dead. There's something of an urban legend regarding Judge's death. It is said that firefighter Daniel Sir died when he was hit by a falling body. Judge then died when he recited the last rites for Sir, then was hit by falling debris when the South Tower collapsed. While this story isn't completely accurate, there's still some truth to it. Daniel Sir's widow, Nancy, confirmed that Judge anointed Daniel, then went back to the North Tower. Witnesses and videotapes of the event confirmed that Judge was killed by falling debris when the South Tower collapsed, and there's no evidence that he ever recited the last rites for Daniel Sir. Some firefighters speculated that Mychal Judge died of a heart attack, but the autopsy confirmed the cause of death to be blunt trauma to the back of the head. Shortly after Judge's death, his body was recovered and carried out shortly before the North Tower collapsed. The image of his body being carried out of Ground Zero is considered one of the most famous photos taken that day. Judge was designated as victim 0001 and thereby recognized as the first victim of the attack due to the fact that his body was the first to be recovered and taken to a medical examiner. After Judge's death, many associates came forward and confirmed that Mychal Judge was gay. The reveal was met with controversy, with some denouncing the reveal as a lie. These claims were refuted with evidence of Judge's sexuality, both from personal testimony and Judge's private journals. Judge was a member of Ginity, a Catholic LGBT organization that advocates for changes in the Catholic Church's teachings on homosexuality. When discussing the Church's teachings, Judge would ask, "Is there so much love in the world that we can afford to discriminate against any kind of love?" On September 15th, 3,000 people attended Judge's funeral mass at St. Francis of Assisi Church, which was presided over by Cardinal Edward Egan, the Archbishop of New York. Former President Bill Clinton and Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton also attended. President Clinton said that Judge's death was a special loss. "We should lift his life up as an example of what has to prevail. We have to be more like Father Mike than the people who killed him." Judge was buried in the Friars Plot and Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Totowa, New Jersey. On October 11, 2001, Brendan Fay organized a Month's Mind Memorial in Good Shepherd Chapel, General Theological Seminary, New York. It was an evening of prayer, stories, traditional Irish music, and personal testimonials about Judge. 3 people in the Roman Catholic Church called for the canonization of Judge. In Catholicism, canonization is a declaration of a deceased person to be officially recognized as a saint. In order to be canonized in the Catholic Church, evidence of a miracle is required. 2 people say they experienced miraculous healings through prayers to Judge, which allowed the Orthodox Catholic Church of America to declare him a saint. Mychal Judge's name is inscribed on panel S18 of the National September 11th Memorial South Pool, along with those of other first responders. When Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., the Fire Department of New York was quick to respond. The quick actions of the FDNY is one of the most important aspects of 9/11. There are many branches of the FDNY acting that day, and these are their stories. First is the heroic response of the FDNY fireboats. At the time, the FDNY only had 6 boats, 3 in frontline service and 3 in reserve. The main 3 we will be focusing on will be the John J. Harvey, FireFighter, and the John D. McKean. Both John J. Harvey and FireFighter were over 63 years old by the time of the attack and had been retired 2 years prior, while John D. McKean was closer to 47 years old and was still in service at the time. Let's start off with the oldest of the 3 vessels, the John J. Harvey. She was commissioned on December 17, 1931, and named after Marine fireman John J. Harvey, who was killed when a ship exploded during a fire. During her 68 years of service, she put out many notable fires, such as the Cunard Line Pier Fire in 1932, the burning of the Normandy in 1942, the burning of the ammunition ship El Estro in 1943, and the collision between oil tankers Avacape and Texaco, Massachusetts in 1966. Her designation changed through the years, from Engine 57 to Engine 86 in 1938, to finally Marine 2 in 1958. This would be the same call sign she would use on September 11th. In 1999, she was retired and sold at an auction to a private group, who were determined to save her from the scrapyard. As soon as Flight 11 struck the North Tower, the owners of the John J. Harvey asked the FDNY if they could assist in what would later be called 9/11 Boat Lift, which was a massive evacuation from Manhattan using all available vessels. While she was carrying out this duty, the FDNY determined that due to the scale of the destruction, most of the water lines are cut off, depriving the fire department of water. They radioed the John J. Harvey asking if her water pump still worked. Luckily, they did. John J. Harvey's crew was told to drop off her passengers and return to ground zero as soon as possible. It was during this time she was reactivated at Marine 2. For 80 hours until water was restored, she pumped water to ground zero. One of her sisters, a firefighter, also had an impressive career before being called into action. Authorized for construction in early 1937 by Mayor Foriello LaGuardia, FireFighter was laid down at United Shipyards as hull number 856 and was christened and launched on August 28, 1938 by Eleanor Grace Flanagan. After fitting out in sea trials, FireFighter officially entered service with the New York City Fire Department on November 16, 1938 at 9 a.m. with Engine 57 at Pier 1 at the Battery, which would later be recognized as Marine Unit 1. She would fight more than 50 major fires through her 61-year career, including fire aboard the SS Normandy in 1942, the burning of the SS El Estro in 1944, the collision between the SS Bruxelles and SS Sea Witch in 1973, which would be the biggest fire she would fight single-handedly. FireFighter rescued 31 survivors from the Sea Witch alone, which earned her the American Merchant Marine Seamanship Trophy, and to this day is the only fireboat to receive this honor. On 9/11, FireFighter responded to the terrorist attack in the World Trade Center and took up a station at the foot of Albany Street in Battery Park City. She began pumping at her maximum capacity to supply water to landside units fighting the fires in the still-standing towers. This would be her longest call, having been on station for 3 weeks. And finally, the John D. McKean, or Marine 1. The John D. McKean was built by John H. Mathis and laid down in 1954. She was named after firefighter John D. McKean, who died in 1953 in a steam explosion while trying to save another ship, the George B. McClellan. On the day of 9/11, the day crew of the McKean were drinking coffee and discussing the day ahead when Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower. The impact was heard, but thought to originate from a nearby construction site. Seconds later, the alarm for the World Trade Center sounded. Captain Mychal, who was aware of the World Trade Center's proximity to the Hudson River, shouted, "Let's go," and started Fireboat McKean. The smoke from the North Tower could be seen from a distance, and as the John D. McKean got closer, the crew watched in horror as people fell from the upper floors. The McKean was parked at the seawall at Liberty Street, just south of North Cove Marina. Captain Mychal told the crew to assemble all the tools, spare masks, cylinders, etc. on the fantail, as Marine 1 would probably be a staging area. He then told the crew to get ready to supply water and left for the command post for instructions. Injured civilians started arriving at the seawall. Firefighter Billy Gilman spotted a man with severe cuts and burns to his head walking around aimlessly. Bill sat him down on a bench and rendered first aid. Afraid the man was in or going into shock, Bill escorted the man to a commuter ferry for transportation to New Jersey. At 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower. The number of injured arriving at the seawall increased. Most were civilians, some were police officers, and firefighters. Each firefighter arrived with injured people, then returned to the scene to help others. During a lull, the crew decided to start stretching supply lines, except for Marine Engineer Dennis Thompson, who said no, as the lines that were needed had not yet been determined. The South Tower collapsed at 9:59 a.m. Captain Mychal was at the command post across the World Trade Center awaiting orders when this happened. Mychal dove, not knowing which way or where, and survived. He was pulled from a pile of debris and rushed to a hospital in Brooklyn. He only suffered minor injuries and returned to the scene a few hours later. Other officers and firefighters feet away were not as lucky. A panic broke out at the seawall. It was low tide and the deck of the John D. McKean was 15 to 20 feet below the wall. Hordes of civilians tried to board the McKean. Some were desperate enough to jump 15 to 20 feet onto the boat, receiving moderate to severe injuries. One man tried to jump, but Marine Engineer Bob Marshall told him to wait. The man jumped anyway, and Bob tried to break his fall. Some civilians tried to untie the mooring lines to hasten their escape, so they had to be restrained. 2 women jumped into the water to escape. A Jacob's ladder was put over the side and wren buoys were thrown to the woman. The McKean's dimensions made hand-to-hand assistance impossible. Marine wiper Greg Woods and Marine engineer Golmar Parga saw the 2 women were too exhausted to help themselves, so jumped into the water. The first woman was assisted onto the ladder and onto the deck. Greg and Golmar got the second woman to the ladder and urged her to climb up. "I can't do it," she replied. "Please, just leave me." Greg Woods then dove underwater and lifted the woman on his shoulders and carried her up the ladder with Golmar's assistance. Men on the other side of the ladder climbed down and pulled the woman aboard. By now, there were fewer people arriving at the wall. There are 200 to 250 people on board the John D. McKean, including children, infants, handicapped people, and 2 dogs. The crew of the McKean had not yet received orders from Captain Mychal, so talked it over and decided it was imperative to get medical attention for the victims on board. The crew agreed to cross the river to New Jersey. The McKean arrived at New Jersey in 10 minutes. When getting the victims off the boat, someone screamed "No," and everyone watched as the North Tower collapsed. The McKean returned to Manhattan, and a few civilians even offered to return to help, and they were welcomed. The John D. McKean arrived back in Manhattan and spent the rest of the day aiding in the aftermath of the towers collapsing. The circumstances made their task a difficult one. The dust cloud limited visibility and communication. Not to mention, the McKean faced issues with pumping water to West Street, as the distance made the water pressure inadequate. Firefighters and volunteers on the scene managed to insert pumps to the supply lines and relayed water to West Street, increasing its volume and pressure. At 11 p.m., the fire department would work a 24-hour on, 24-hour off schedule. However, due to communication problems, some firefighters worked longer than necessary. However, some firefighters refused to leave. Some had to be ordered back to McKean to get some sleep. Every FDNY engine company carries several lengths of 3.5-inch hoses. Marine One stripped every available engine company of their 3.5-inch hoses, as well as her own 3.5-inch hoses. Marine One used approximately 250 lengths of 3.5-inch hoses and 20 lengths of 5-inch hoses. The John D. McKean continued supplying water until September 14th. Now for what happened to each ship after 9/11. On July 17, 2010, FireFighter was officially decommissioned and was turned into a museum ship. A similar fate was in store for her sister vessel, John D. McKean, which was placed out of service in 2010 and is now being restored to her former glory. The hope is to have her restored in time for the 20th anniversary. Both FireFighter and John D. McKean were replaced by fireboats that were sponsored by a grant from the Department of Homeland Security. FireFighter was replaced by FireFighter 2, while John D. McKean was replaced by 343, in reference to the exact number of firefighters killed in New York during the attack. 343 was commissioned on September 11, 2010 at 9 a.m., exactly 9 years after the 2001 terrorist attacks. Ladder Company 3 is one of the oldest fire companies in New York City and one of 2 companies in the Fire Department of New York's 6th Battalion, 1st Division. Ladder Company 3 was founded on September 11, 1865, 136 years to the day that it would be thrown into one of the worst attacks America has ever suffered. When Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower, the FDNY immediately sprang into action, deploying fire and rescue units to the North Tower. Upon arrival, senior fire officials called for a 5th alarm to bring in more engines and ladder companies along with elite rescue units to the scene. The North Tower was struck just as Ladder Company 3 was having a shift change, so many off-duty firefighters attended the operation. By 9 a.m., FDNY members realized that a firefighting mission was impossible, and that their only option was a rescue mission. Command and control stations were set up, including one in the lobby of the North Tower. The FDNY suffered from a lack of information as to what was happening in the North Tower. At 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower. Despite the increased difficulty of the mission, firefighters on the scene did not slow down. Ladder Company 3 was assigned to head up the North Tower to find and evacuate burned and/or injured victims. Captain Patrick "Patty" Brown, leader of Ladder Company 3, reported that he and his men were about a third of the way up the North Tower by 9:21 a.m. While firefighters were climbing the tower, they were met with civilians going down. Exiting civilians reported the presence of firefighters gave them a sense of calm and assurance that help had arrived. Firefighters would periodically stop and check floors to see if everyone has evacuated and help those who have yet to escape. When the South Tower collapsed, all the command posts in the North Tower lobby, Marriott Hotel lobby, and staging areas on West Street ceased operation due to their close proximity to the South Tower. 2 minutes after the collapse, a fire chief in the North Tower issued an order to all units to evacuate. At least 2 battalion chiefs on the upper floors passed the order along. However, some firefighters didn't hear the evacuation order, while others refused to leave until everyone had exited safely. By 10:24 a.m., 5 FDNY companies had reached the bottom of Stairwell B, then the lobby of the North Tower, exiting onto West Street. When the North Tower collapsed, 11 members of Ladder Company 3 were killed. Along with Ladder Company 3, 335 other members of the FDNY were killed. 37 Port Authority Police Department officers died, and 23 NYPD officers died. When the tower collapsed, Ladder Company 3's truck was damaged beyond repair. According to Marine D1 Gilligan, whose brother was one of the firefighters killed on 9/11, the truck was crushed in a heartbeat. The front was sheared off. The 11 members of Ladder Company 3 who died during the collapse of the North Tower were Captain Patrick Paddy Brown, age 48, Lieutenant Kevin W. Donnelly, age 43, Michael Carroll, age 39, James Raymond Coyle, age 26, Gerald D. Wan, age 35, Jeffrey John Giordano, age 45, Joseph Maloney, age 45, John Kevin McAvoy, age 47, Timothy Patrick McSweeney, age 37, Joseph J. Oregon, age 30, and Stephen John Olson, age 38. Ladder Company's 3 apparatus was deemed a total loss and was placed inside Hangar 17 at John F. Kennedy International Airport. It wasn't until 2011, 10 years after the attack, that the truck was moved to its permanent home at the 9/11 Memorial. The 60,000-pound truck, flag-draped, was lowered 70 feet underground into the museum, witnessed by firefighters, families of the victims, and ordinary citizens. When thinking of 9/11, most people remember the attack on the World Trade Center in New York City. However, as many of us know, the World Trade Center was not the only target, as Flight 77 struck the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. There are many heroes acting at the Pentagon, the first of which is Lieutenant Colonel Paul Ted Anderson. Anderson worked at the Pentagon when the World Trade Center was attacked. Anderson recalled watching news coverage of New York City and even saw the second plane crash into the South Tower live. "We watched it live," he said, "and I almost threw up." Not too long after the second crash, Anderson received a phone call from his then-wife to discuss the attacks. Anderson remained on the phone with his wife when Flight 77 crashed into the west facade of the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m. The plane struck between wedges 1 and 2, and Anderson was in 2. Anderson described the feeling when the plane struck. "The entire building literally felt like it had completely lifted off the foundation. I said, 'We've been bombed, I have to go,' and hung up. And I got up and I started screaming for people to get out of the office." At first, it wasn't clear to everyone in the building what happened. Some believed it was a bomb. One security guard even considered the possibility that the bomb was used as a diversion to trick Pentagon workers outside to be gunned down. Anderson was warned of this, however, he didn't hear any shooting, so opened the doors and instructed workers to get outside. Once outside, Anderson and Army Staff Sergeant Christopher Brahman ran towards the crash site. Chris and I noticed at that point that there were 2 women lying outside on the ground. The first woman that I came to had a compound fracture of the hip, and you could see the bone exposed. It was at this point she was going into shock. Anderson carried the woman away from the building, then he and Brahman ran back inside the Pentagon to look for others. They found a woman pinned under a drawer safe. They helped her out from under it and helped her outside. Then they found a man on fire who they extinguished and carried outside. It was after they helped the burn victim that a confrontation with the fire department happened. Military personnel tried to return to the building to save their peers. However, firefighters are trained to prevent people from returning to a burning building once they escaped, so they instructed military personnel to stay outside, despite their insistence to return to help fallen comrades. The arguments became so heated that some general officers had to step in to de-escalate. Anderson said, "It wasn't long thereafter that whole portion of the Pentagon caved in. Had we been in there, we would have all been killed." Lieutenant Colonel Paul Ted Anderson and the firefighters weren't the only heroes that acted that day. Another noteworthy person is State Trooper Mike Middleton. At the time of the crash, Middleton was a few miles to the west on Route 267. He pulled over a motorist to issue a citation when he heard a colleague, Trooper Merlin Wimbish, shout over the radio that a plane crashed into the Pentagon. Middleton immediately set out. When he turned south on Route 110, Middleton heard another explosion, followed by a roiling column of smoke. Once on scene, Middleton ran to the smoking hole in the side of the building. Middleton recalled, "I yelled to a Pentagon officer that Merlin was inside, and he pointed at an opening to the right of the impact site, and I just ran into that opening. I was immediately doused with a huge wall of water because a water line had ruptured. I remember yelling to Merlin. I could hear his voice. I couldn't see him because it was pitch black and the smoke was so thick in there." Middleton doesn't remember how he ended up at the crash site. He only remembers directing 3 military personnel to the glow of Wimbish's flashlight. "We started searching the area. At one point, it looked like a big auditorium. Chunks of debris from the plane and the building were glowing red. It was like a nightmare. I felt like I was in hell, because the only illumination we had was from the glowing chunks of the plane. Middleton deduced that there were no survivors in the immediate crash site. Middleton and Wimbush helped a Pentagon officer and a renovation contractor to a second-floor corridor. Middleton and Wimbush continued to search for survivors until the heat became too intense for them to continue further. Middleton and Wimbush checked the third floor, then the fourth. It was on the fourth floor where they encountered fire and rescue personnel who instructed them to leave the building. That's when I realized I was having trouble breathing, because I wasn't covering my face. I was just full of fear and adrenaline. When we started coming down, I started feeling dizzy. There was another explosion, and I remember a guy grabbed me and said, "Run." And then we were on adrenaline again, and I just remember going from intense heat to, it felt freezing cold outside, and that's when I blacked out. Middleton would wake up 4 days later in the hospital with first and second degree burns to his lungs and trachea. After the attack, it was originally estimated that it would take 3 years to rebuild the damaged section of the Pentagon, but it was finished by the first anniversary of the attack. The rebuilt section has a small indoor memorial and chapel at the point of impact. On May 16, 2006, the Department of Defense released security footage of Flight 77 crashing into the Pentagon. The footage is choppy and low quality. In fact, Flight 77 is only visible for one frame, but it does show the aftermath of the crash. On September 12, 2002, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and General Richard Myers dedicated the victims of the Pentagon attack on the Pentagon Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. The memorial honors 5 victims whose identifiable remains have been found. Portions of the remains of 25 other victims are also buried in the area. The memorial is a Pentagon-shaped granite marker measuring 4.5 feet tall. Along the top are inscribed the words, "Victims of terrorist attacks on the Pentagon, September 11, 2001. Each face of the Pentagon has black aluminum plates inscribed with the names of the 184 victims of the attack. The memorial is located in Section 64 in a slight rise, giving it a view of the Pentagon. At the National September 11th Memorial in New York, the names of the Pentagon victims are inscribed on 6 panels at the South Pool. The Pentagon Memorial is located southwest of the Pentagon itself. It's a permanent memorial to the 184 victims of the attack. It was designed by Julie Beckman and Keith Caseman with engineer Brewer Hoppold. The memorial was officially opened on September 11, 2008, 7 years after the attack. United Airlines Flight 93 was one of the planes hijacked by terrorists during the 9/11 attacks. Flight 93 is unique in that it did not reach its intended target, but instead crashed in a field in Stony Creek Township, Pennsylvania, due to an attempt by passengers and crew to regain control of the craft from the hijackers. Flight 93 was a Boeing 757-222 with a capacity of 182 occupants, although the 9/11 flight had 33 passengers, 4 terrorists, and 7 crew, totaling 44 occupants. The flight was piloted by Captain Jason Dahl and First Officer Leroy Homer Jr. The 4 hijackers were Zaya Jarrah, the leader, Ahmed Al-Nami, Ahmed Al-Haznawi, and Sahed Al-Ghami. Haznawi and Ghamdi both boarded Flight 93 at 7:39 a.m. and sat first class in seats 6B and 3D. Nami boarded 1 minute later and sat first class in seat 3C. Jarrah boarded at 7:48 and sat first class in seat 1B. The craft was scheduled to depart at 8 a.m., but was delayed until 8:42 due to heavy import congestion. By the time Flight 93 became airborne, Flight 11 was 4 minutes from striking the North Tower, Flight 175 was being hijacked, and Flight 77 was 9 minutes away from being hijacked. Flight 93 reached cruising altitude 1 minute before Flight 175 hit the South Tower. The hijacking of Flight 93 began at 9:28 a.m. By this time, Flights 11 and 175 crashed into the World Trade Center, and Flight 77 was 9 minutes from striking the Pentagon. The hijackers of Flight 93 wrapped red bandanas around their heads and sprang from their seats. At 9:28:05, the flight was flying 35,000 feet over East Ohio before suddenly dropping 685 feet. 11 seconds into the descent, Cleveland Air Traffic Control heard a man shout, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," into the cockpit radio. Controller John Worth didn't know the source of the call, so simply replied, "Somebody called Cleveland," before noticing Flight 93's rapid descent. At 9:28:50, John received a second transmission. It has not been officially confirmed who was shouting in the clip, Jason Dahl or Leroy Homer Jr., but Leroy's wife, Melody, claimed it was her husband upon listening to the recording. Flight 93 dropped 685 feet in half a minute before the hijackers stabilized the craft at 34,315 feet. Flight 93 was the only hijacked flight on 9/11 to send a distress call, as the pilots were warned of the attack on the World Trade Center and to be aware of possible hijackers. This allowed the pilots to press the radio microphone button when attacked to warn controllers of the situation. At 9:31:57, the cockpit voice recorder began recording the final 30 minutes of Flight 93, starting with Jarrah announcing, Jarrah tried to send the message to the passengers, but pressed the wrong button and sent the transmission to Cleveland air controllers instead. Recordings play the sound of a man pleading "no more" before the hijackers shouted at him to sit down and stop touching something. Jason Dahl's wife, Sandy, believes this proves her husband tried to interfere with the hijackers by disengaging autopilot and changing the plane's radio frequency so that Jarrah's attempts to communicate with the passengers instead went to air traffic controllers. At 9:35:09, Jarrah instructed the autopilot to turn the plane and head east. The craft ascended 40,700 feet and air traffic controllers immediately moved several aircraft out of Flight 93's path. 2 minutes after Flight 77 struck the Pentagon, air traffic controllers heard Jarrah say,
Hi, this is the captain. I would like to remain medium. We are on board and are going to take the airport and our demand.
At 9:30, passengers and crew began making phone calls. A total of 37 calls were made, 35 air phone calls, and 2 cell phone calls. At 9:32, passenger Tom Burnett made several calls to his wife, Dina. He explained the situation, including the information that a passenger had been stabbed with a knife and died. It is believed that passenger Mark Rothenberg was the victim, considering he was the only first-class passenger not to make any phone calls after the hijacking and was seated in 5B, directly in front of Hasnawi in 6B. It is possible that Hasnawi attacked Rothenberg to scare the passengers into compliance. Dina informed Tom of the attack in New York, and Tom asked for details and informed fellow passengers as he was updated by his wife. In their next call, Dina informed Tom of the attack on the Pentagon. Tom then informed Dina that he and the other passengers were forming a plan to retake the plane. He ended the call with, "Don't worry, we're going to do something." The passenger revolt began at 9:57. The hijackers became aware at 9:57:57. Jarrah asked, "Is there something? A fight?" Jarrah began to roll the plane left to right in an attempt to throw passengers off balance. At 9:59:52, Jarrah changed tactics by pitching the nose up and down to disrupt the assault. The cockpit recorder captured sounds of crashing, screaming, and shattering glass. This was followed by shouts of pain, indicating one of the hijackers was attacked by the passengers. Jarrah stabilized the plane at 10:03. 5 seconds later, he asked, "Is that it? Shall we finish it off?" Another hijacker replied, "No, not yet. When they all come, we finish it off." Around 10:41, passengers began using the food cart as a battering ram against the cockpit door. Jarrah ceased violent maneuvers at 10:01, then recited the tack bar twice before asking another hijacker, "Is that it? I mean, shall we put it down?" The other hijacker answered, "Yes, put it in it and pull it down." The passengers continued their assault. At 10:02:33, Jarrah pleaded in Arabic, "Hey, give it to me," possibly referring to the plane's yoke. The last words in the recorder are a calm instruction in English, "Pull it up." Flight 93 crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 10:03:11. There is some controversy between some of the family of the passengers and investigative officials as to whether the passengers managed to breach the cockpit. The 9/11 Commission report officially states that the hijackers remained at the controls, but must have judged that the passengers were only seconds from overcoming them. Family members believe the passengers managed to breach the cockpit and killed at least one of the hijackers. Some interpreted Jarrah's pleading to indicate that the passengers were fighting for control of the yoke. Flight 93 crashed near a coal strip mine known as the Diamond T Mine. The National Transportation Safety Board reported that Flight 93 impacted at 563 miles per hour at a 40-degree inverted attitude. The crash left a crater 8 to 10 feet deep and 30 to 50 feet wide. All 44 people on board died. Many media outlets and witnesses claimed the plane crashed around 10:06 or 10:10. An initial analysis of seismographic data concluded the crash occurred at 10:06, but the 9/11 Commission report claimed this analysis wasn't definitive and was retracted. The Commission report concluded the time of crash as 10:03 based on flight recordings, radar data, infrared satellite data, and air traffic control transmissions. Most of the wreckage was found near the impact crater. Light debris, including paper and nylon, were scattered up to 8 miles from the impact point. Other tiny aircraft fragments were found 1.5 miles away at Indian Lake. Human remains were found within a 70-acre area surrounding the impact point. Somerset County Coroner Wally Miller was involved in the investigation and identification of the remains. He ended up finding 1,500 pieces of human remains, totaling at 600 pounds. The rest of the remains were consumed by the impact. Investigators identified 4 victims by September 12th, 11 victims by September 24th, 12 by September 29th, and 34 by October 27th. Everyone on board was identified by December 21st. The cause of death for the 40 victims was listed as homicide, while the cause of death for the hijackers was listed as suicide. The remains and possessions of the victims were returned to their families, while the remains of the hijackers were turned over to the FBI. All passengers and crew of Flight 93 were nominated for the Congressional Gold Medal on September 19, 2001, and were granted on September 11, 2014. The obverse of the medal reads, "A common field one day, a field of honor forever." The reverse features 40 stars, representing the 40 passengers and crew, and reads, "We honor the passengers and crew of Flight 93 who perished in a Pennsylvania field on September 11, 2001. Their courageous acts will be remembered forever." The casualties of 9/11 were the highest any fire department in the world had suffered. Along with FDNY Chief Peter James Gansey Jr., FDNY Commissioner William Michael Feehan, and FDNY Fire Marshal Ronald Paul Bucca, 20 chiefs, 22 captains, 46 lieutenants, and 252 firefighters were all killed on that day. Even to this day, hundreds are dying from the toxic chemicals and carcinogenic dust released in the air by the collapse of the towers. Shortly after the attacks, Congress created the September 11th Victim Compensation for the benefit of victims of the attack or their families. In July 2019, NYPD Deputy Julius Alvarez gave an emotional testimony to Congress advocating to extend the 9/11 Victim Fund. Alvarez died 3 weeks later of cancer caused by a search and rescue operation at Ground Zero. Congress passed a bill to extend the 9/11 Victims Fund to 2092. The attacks brought out a new wave of anger, not just in the American people, but in the world, and in a way, woke a sleeping giant. The nations of the world were quick to stand up for the victims of the attack. 3 days after 9/11, a famous encounter between 2 U.S. destroyers and a German destroyer occurred. While sailing, the USS Winston Churchill and USS Gonzales were approached by the German destroyer Lutjens. The German crew had manned the rails and held a banner reading, "We stand by you." The banner in question was prepared in 20 minutes and written on a simple bedsheet, but its message was nonetheless powerful. The banner is set to be displayed at the Navy's new museum, dedicated to archiving the Navy's 246-year history. American armed forces were quick to respond as well. One example is when the USS Enterprise, CVN-65, was informed of the attack. According to the documentary Hero Ships, the captain, later Rear Admiral Sandy Winefield, told the crew the last time the US was surprise attacked, their predecessor, Enterprise, CV-6, was the first to order a blow against the enemy, and that CVN-65 would be given the same opportunity. On October 7th, USS Enterprise struck back as the first aircraft carrier to strike on the war against terrorism. It's also interesting to note that several ships have been built with the attacks in mind. 3 of the San Antonio-class amphibious transport dock ships. The first is LPD-21. Shortly after 9/11, Governor of New York George E. Pataki wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, Gordon R. England, requesting that the Navy bestow the name New York to a surface warship involved in the global war on terrorism in honor of the victims of the September 11th attacks. In his letter, the governor said he understood the state names were reserved for submarines, but asked for special exceptions so the name could be given to a surface ship. The request was approved on August 28, 2002, and LPD-21 would sail under the name USS New York. She was laid down on September 10, 2004, almost 3 years to the day of the attack. As tribute to the victims, steel from the World Trade Center was melted down to form the stem bar, part of the ship's bow. 7.5 short tons of the steel used in the ship's construction came from the rubble of the World Trade Center. This represents less than 1/1000th of the ship's total weight. The steel was melted down in Amite Foundry and Machine in Amite, Louisiana, to cast the ship's bow section on September 9, 2003. The foundry workers reportedly treated it with reverence usually accorded to religious relics, gently touching it as they walked by. One worker delayed his retirement after 40 years of working to be part of the project. When the ship was christened, members of the NYPD and FDNY, as well as families of the victims, were in attendance. On September 2, 2009, the ship passed the World Trade Center site for the first time and gave the 21-gun salute. A few days later, on November 7th, she was commissioned in New York. Her motto is, "Strength forged through sacrifice. Never forget." The other two ships are the USS Arlington, LPD-24, and USS Somerset, LPD-25. Their hulls are made of steel from the Pentagon and a crane that's set near the Flight 93 crash site. On April 28, 2003, a competition for the official design of a 9/11 memorial began. The competition pooled 13,683 competitors from 94 nations. On July 17th, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, or LMDC, received 5,201 submissions. 8 finalists were revealed at the Winter Garden on November 19th. On January 2, 2004, the submission Reflecting Absence by Michael Arad and Peter Walker was selected the winner. Construction of the memorial began on March 13, 2006, with most of the construction finished by the 10th anniversary of the attacks. The memorial consists of 2 large pools, each nearly an acre in size, both located where the Twin Towers once stood. The 16-acre land has a total of 400 trees on site, and over the years has been visited by more than 43 million people. On March 13, 2006, construction of the 9/11 Museum began. The museum was dedicated on May 15, 2014, and opened to the public on May 21st. The dedication was attended by then-President Barack Obama, former President Bill Clinton and his wife Hillary Clinton, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, former NYC Mayors David Dinkins, Rudy Giuliani, and Michael Bloomberg, along with current Mayor Bill de Blasio. The opening ceremony on May 21st was attended by 24 police officers and firefighters who unfurled the restored 30-foot 9/11 national flag. Tickets to the museum sold out on opening day. The museum houses over 40,000 images, 14,000 artifacts, 3,500 recordings, and 500 hours of video. The museum also houses steel from the Twin Towers, such as the last column, which was the last piece of steel to leave Ground Zero in May 2002. The 9/11 Museum has attracted more than 14 million visitors since its opening in 2014. On April 27, 2006, construction on the One World Trade Center began. The construction process lasted 7 years, 6 months, and 3 days, officially opening on November 3, 2014. The One World Trade Center is currently the tallest building in the United States in the Western Hemisphere and the 6th tallest building in the world. U.S. citizens were involved with something that hadn't happened since the attack on Pearl Harbor and brought a new wave of sadness, yet a desire for justice. Nearly 10 years after the attack, U.S. Navy SEALs gave Americans their justice. On May 2, 2011, 2 helicopters carried a special team of U.S. Navy SEALs, simply known as SEAL Team 6, into Abbottabad, Pakistan, where Osama bin Laden was hiding in a secure compound. While reports of the events contradict each other, Osama bin Laden was killed on the 3rd floor of the compound. Then-President Barack Obama later went on all major news networks later that night to announce that bin Laden was indeed dead. In the aftermath, people around the world celebrated, including at Ground Zero, where everyday civilians, hundreds of firefighters, most of whom survived the attack, cried tears of joy and sadness as the man responsible was brought to justice. The 9/11 attacks were devastating, but it brought the world together. Even some of America's former enemies in the Cold War condemned the attacks and honored the victims, such as Russian President Vladimir Putin, who told U.S. Secretary Advisor Condoleezza Rice that all hostilities would be put aside so we could deal with the tragedy. Even China and North Korea condemned the attacks. Osama bin Laden's plan ultimately backfired. Instead of invoking fear into the world came together in order to bring some sort of peace, even if it wouldn't last long. It is important to remember all of those who died. As we close this episode, we would like to honor the family and friends of the 9/11 victims for staying strong and persevering. We would also like to honor the heroes who gave their lives in one of the darkest days in modern history.